Trump has reshaped politics the world over, but trying to influence elections, here in Europe at least, has largely backfired for him. Now his administration has launched an almost $5 million scheme for non-governmental groups to support free speech and religious liberty, because Trump reckons Europe has drifted away from democracy. Now US efforts to fund European politics has evolved over the years, but it's always been about democracy. After the Second World War, the US pumped over $13 billion via the Marshall Plan into Western Europe, more like $150 billion in today's terms. The reconstruction program had a political agenda, stabilise democracy to hold back communism. During the Cold War, the CIA was involved in covert anti-communist operations, pouring millions of dollars into Italy to prevent the Italian Communist Party from winning elections. From the 80s onwards, institutional funding became the standard. The German Marshall Fund of the United States and US government arms like the National Endowment for Democracy began openly funding political groups, think tanks and civil society, promoting democracy. But all of a sudden, the definition of democracy is now open to interpretation. Have a look at the goals and objectives of this new program from the State Department. The purpose of democratic government is to protect natural rights and fundamental freedoms, including free speech and religious liberty, while ensuring citizens can freely choose their elected officials and hold their governments accountable. It goes on to say that for centuries, the transatlantic partnership has been rooted in a common understanding of natural law, virtue and national sovereignty. However, European governments are increasingly drifting from these foundations through supranational bureaucratic overreach and partisan weaponization that concentrates power in technocratic institutions less accountable to democratic choices. So is the Trump administration trying to interfere in European politics? Our chief political correspondent, Nina Haase, put that question today to the German Chancellor.
The State Department in the US has launched a grant program worth nearly $5 million, trying to support political groupings, but also civil groupings that in Europe that foster something they say is Western civilizational heritage, migration, national sovereignty, free speech. Critics say that this initiative is aimed at supporting ideologically linked groups to the AfD. Is this something that you would say is something that is valid, advocacy for democracy by an ally, or is that political interference in Europe?
I have always said that we, for our part, do not interfere in American elections. We have always stuck to that, and conversely, I do not want the American government or government-affiliated institutions to interfere in German elections. And perhaps I should add that it is illegal to finance political parties in Germany from abroad. It is illegal, and I assume that especially our friends in the world will also abide by the legal rules that we have established here in Germany.
Majda Ruge joins us from the European Council on Foreign Relations. Is US President Donald Trump trying to interfere politically here in Europe?
Thanks, Ben. I think that question really requires looking at the bigger picture of what Trump administration has been doing since they took office, and not just at this one element. If you take, Vice President J.D. Vance's speech at the Munich Security Conference in 2025, when he called for Germany to bring down the Brandmauer, or if you think about J.D. Vance going to Hungary to campaign for Viktor Orban, I think these are quite clear instances of political meddling or political interference. Similarly, the comments coming from Washington in the middle of the trial of Marine Le Pen, which was described by the Trump administration as a witch hunt. These you can call definitely instances of political interference, which are designed as an extension of really Trump's administration domestic project, which is their war on liberalism at home.
Okay, when you talk about the Brandmauer, you're talking about this political firewall. Could you just explain that to viewers?
Yes. So the decisions of the mainstream parties in Germany not to go into coalition with the AfD, Alternative for Germany, the populist far-right party, which has a very problematic wing in its construction and which has been a norm that has held in Germany for a long time. Mm-hmm. The Vice President J.D. Vance and many people in the Trump administration and the inner circle have, through their war on liberalism, or more constitutional liberalism at home, decided that their natural allies in Europe are the parties on the far right, populist parties, which have very similar program on certain cultural issues like gender policies, education, very strongly on immigration. And so the statement by Vice President at the Munich Security Conference was geared towards saying, this is ridiculous, you need to get rid of this norm and you need to include the AfD into your governing coalitions.
So very anti-wokeism, very anti-globalism, and anti-liberalism. But this is also something that's not just happening here in Germany. You've also got the Polish presidential elections, for example. Ahead of them last year, the right-wing nationalist candidate at the time, Karol Nawrocki, met Donald Trump, saying the US president signaled support. And after winning the election, Nawrocki returned to Washington later in the year on his first foreign trip as president. In Hungary this year, Vice President J.D. Vance gave his support to then President Viktor Orban, who ruled what he proudly called an illiberal democracy. Well, despite making the flight all the way to Europe, that didn't work out. The populist kleptocrat was kicked out by a campaigner against state corruption, Peter Mojo. And in Romania last year, hard-right politician George Simeon campaigned on a slogan of "Make Europe Great Again," taking a page out of Trump's playbook. But that didn't work either. He'd lost the election. So, Nina, or Majda rather, tell me, where does this bring us? I mean, Trump trying and J.D. Vance trying to get support for these far-right politicians and their parties, but in some cases it doesn't work out, does it?
Yeah. Yes, it doesn't, but I don't think we can generalize from there. I think that let's just stick with Hungary for a moment. I think that Viktor Orban's case was very specific because he was campaigning after a decade of a very centralized rule in which he has absolutely centralized the power in the hands of the executive, weakened the legislative and judiciary checks and balances, weakened the media, and has then really pursued and ran the state as his private business. And so I think it's such a great example of a distinction that I'd like to make for this discussion, and that is the distinction between constitutional liberalism and cultural liberalism. And I think we really cannot, we need to be careful not to conflate the two, because a war against constitutional liberalism, which Trump administration is also pursuing at home and abroad, is basically centralization of power and weakening of democratic checks and balances. Cultural liberalism is really about conservative versus liberal values when it comes to gender policies, family, education, migration, etc. And I think, very often this cultural liberalism and war against cultural liberalism is really used as a populist tool to gloss over the fact that behind that is a bigger project, and that is centralization of the power in the executive and demolishing of the checks and balances. And, as we go into the discussion about the State Department's programs for supporting the, civilizationally affiliated think tanks and organizations, that is an issue of cultural liberalism, but where we need to be really careful is what at the same time might be happening on the democratic side of constitutional liberalism.
Okay, well, let's just take a look at this program that's been launched by the State Department. The DRL-NOFO, Developing Civilization Bonds, Democratic Resilience and Rule of Law in Europe. Okay, people may be wondering what all that means. The DRL is the Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights and Labor, a specific bureau within the US State Department that handles global labor rights, democratic freedoms and human rights. And then NOFO means a Notice of Funding Opportunity. What I find interesting is civilizational bonds. I looked that up, and these are deep-seated shared connections that tie different societies, nations or ethnic groups together based on a common cultural heritage. Unlike modern political alliances, these bonds develop over centuries. What are they trying to tell me in calling this a civilizational bond?
Well, I think that is precisely the part of Orban's project, which he very much advertised on sort of returning Hungary to its traditional Christian identity. Mm-hmm. If you think about it, Orban's whole anti-immigration agenda and, if you want, taking back the power from the globalist, unaccountable European Union towards national sovereignty is something that's very much at the core of the civilizational program. It is utopian, obviously, since there is no way you can reverse the demographic trends and changes which have happened in, over decades and longer. But in essence, it's this utopian idea that you can return Europe to its sort of core Christian civilization that is undisturbed by both migrants as well as, other groups with more progressive ideas when it comes to culture. Mm-hmm. So I think that is more, the description really is very far from what we can get in reality.
Okay.
But I think the real question is, what is really behind these programs for Trump administration? Because on many of these issues, take immigration, which is at the center of their campaign. On many of these issues, Trump administration could find partners in Europe that are already in government. If you just take Denmark and Danish government, which has pursued a very strict program of, processing the asylum applications, returning the rejected asylum seekers, basically a policy that comes very close to what Trump administration is describing they're looking for. These are not the actors that Trump administration is supporting. In fact, they are supporting mostly the disruptive parties on the far right that are very much opposed to the EU and the European Union regulation. And I think that's pretty much, at the core of that agenda.
It's interesting that Meloni and Trump aren't quite getting along anymore.
Yes. Well, whether they're getting along or not is we do not have insights into their conversations behind the closed doors. But yes, we have seen the escalation on the social media, which is, I think completely understandable from Meloni's side. I think she's done quite well in raising her popularity with her responses to Trump, who is not very popular at the moment in Europe.
But doesn't Trump need Meloni to push this agenda of his? Doesn't he need allies here in Europe to make some sort of dent politically if that's what the aim is?
Sure, but he doesn't need, and he's not even seeking Meloni's help in promoting this agenda. I really think it's important to realize that the agenda that they describe to be promoting, just take immigration and take, seeking for affiliated partners in Europe. Even if you're talking about sort of Christian civilizational values, are they really going to the CDU in Germany and Chancellor Merz, who has announced a program that he wants to implement that is tougher on immigration, that imposes controls, that has, an approach that comes at least closer to what Trump administration is claiming to seek? They have not sought partnership with incumbent governments. What they have sought is really to empower parties that are against the EU rather than, and who are not even able at this point to implement an immigration program because they're not they do not have power. And so I really think we need to understand that a lot of the discourse about the identity politics, including immigration, education, gender issues, is not something that they are really truly pursuing with partners in Europe, even if these are sort of center-right governments or more on the right like Meloni. I genuinely believe that there is more to it, and European Union's ability to regulate, for instance, the big tech companies from Silicon Valley operating on European market through Digital Services Act or through Digital Market Act is something the Trump administration does not view very favorably. In fact, they hate it. And so empowering the parties that are anti-EU, in their view, is a vehicle for weakening the European Union's regulatory power. And that's why you also find so many references to media censorship that they're fighting against in Europe. And that media censorship usually applies to the attempts to regulate social media companies and tech companies who come from the United States in Europe.
As Majda mentions, the new funding scheme also appears to target efforts by the European Union to regulate big tech from the US. Tech bro Elon Musk calls the regulation attempts an attack on free speech. The EU says it's not censorship, but enforcement of consumer protection. So this is about business and politics, obviously. Here's Majda again.
There's disagreements between people who follow this and experts who write about this, but I think that big part of this campaign, because there's so much stress on freedom of expression and on censorship, that big part of this campaign really relates to European Union's competence and power to regulate the US tech companies, both through Digital Services Act, which basically regulates the content on social media and the algorithms, to what extent there's fact checking, to what extent there's amplification of basically news that are often not fact checked, and to what extent there is really a balanced news feed on social media. Is one, and the other one is to regulate the monopoly positions on the European market through the Digital Market Act. And I think clearly both of these, the rulings that the European Commission has passed have imposed big costs on American tech companies. Trump administration has already threatened to retaliate with new tariffs each time a new ruling or a new case appears. So it is one big driving force behind the campaign of, establishing this civilizational balance through so-called elimination of censorship. I think lastly, on the sort of funding of political actors, they're not going to be able to directly fund political parties.
No.
Neither have they announced that intention. But more importantly, the European laws about foreign financing of political parties would make this illegal. And I think that if we just look at, the case of Marine Le Pen, which was not about foreign financing, it was about misusing European parliamentary funds, you still see that European Union has the tools to basically prevent misuse of funds or foreign funding coming in. And I think this is why any sort of direct financing of the opposition parties is going to be very difficult, if not impossible.
Majda Ruge, thank you very much for chiming in tonight. It's been great talking to you.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
What's your opinion on foreign countries meddling in other nations' politics? And is it always a legitimate attempt at upholding human rights abroad? I'm Ben Fajzullin. I'd love to hear from you.